There was a moment in human history when the world was, for the first time, connected. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, physically, materially, economically connected, through ships, roads, caravans, and clay tablets inscribed with the language of commerce. It happened roughly 3,000 years ago, and it was extraordinary. By the late Bronze Age, the great civilizations of the ancient world had built something no generation before them had ever achieved, an interlinked system of trade, diplomacy, and production stretching from the Nile Valley to the Aegean, from the coasts of the Levant to the mountains of Central Asia. Egypt moved grain in quantities that fed armies and cities across borders. Levantine ports like Ugarit processed merchant ships from a dozen different cultures in a single season. Cyprus extracted copper from its soil and loaded it onto vessels bound for workshops across the eastern Mediterranean. And somewhere far to the east, in the highlands of Afghanistan, in the mines of Central Asia, workers cut tin from the earth, tin that would travel thousands of miles before it ever had a purpose. Because alone copper was useful, and alone tin was almost irrelevant. But combined, 10 parts copper, 1 part tin, they produced bronze, the metal that made everything possible. Weapons, tools, agricultural implements, architectural fittings, the infrastructure of civilization itself. But every connection created dependency. The palace states that governed this world were marvels of administrative complexity. In Mycenae, in Hattusa, in Memphis, in Babylon, scribes sat in lamplit rooms and pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. Every shipment tracked, every tax recorded, every grain allocation registered. The bureaucratic machines of the Bronze Age were precise instruments of economic control. Linear B tablets from Mycenae record rations for rowers. Hittite archives document diplomatic marriages, negotiated like trade agreements. Egyptian papyri track tribute flowing in from vassal territories. This was not a world of primitive exchange. This was a world of institutional memory. Precision required stability. The flow of raw materials across the Bronze Age world was not random. It followed corridors, maritime lanes, overland caravan routes, river valleys that had been established over generations. Copper moved west from Cyprus. Tin moved southwest from Central Asia through intermediary trading posts. Grain moved north and east from Egypt along the Levantine coast. The map of Bronze Age trade was a map of mutual reliance. Every node depended on every other node. A palace in Hatti needed tin from thousands of miles away, simply to equip its soldiers. A Mycenaean warlord could not arm his warriors without a supply chain that crossed open water and hostile terrain. Remove one link, and the entire structure began to strain. Down in the copper mines of Cyprus, workers descended into the earth before sunrise. The air was thick with dust and heat. The tools were simple. The labor was relentless. Copper extraction was backbreaking, localized, irreplaceable work. No other region in the eastern Mediterranean produced it in comparable quantity. When those mines supplied, empires functioned. When supply wavered, everything downstream felt it. The workshops, the armories, the palace storerooms, the armies waiting in the field. Distance made everything vulnerable. The political order of the late Bronze Age was built on a delicate architecture of diplomacy. Egypt, Hatti, Assyria, Babylon, Mycenae, Mitanni. The great powers recognized each other across borders, not with ideology, not with religion, but with letters. Correspondence between kings filled royal archives. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt in the 19th century, reveal a world of monarchs who addressed one another as brothers, who negotiated marriages and gold shipments with the careful language of professionals managing risk. "Send me gold," wrote one king to another. "Gold in your land is like dust." Peace required constant negotiation, but beneath the diplomatic surface, the system carried weight it was not designed to bear indefinitely. Agricultural zones that had fed the Bronze Age world for centuries were beginning to show signs of strain. Pollen records, sediment analysis, tree ring data, the scientific record slowly assembled by archaeologists and climatologists, tells a consistent story. The Eastern Mediterranean was getting drier. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but measurably, gradually. Enough that harvests began to fall short of what palace accountants had come to expect. Harvests begin to fail. The grain that moved through Bronze Age trade networks was not a luxury commodity. It was structural. Cities could not feed themselves. Armies could not march without it. Palatial bureaucracies had been built on the assumption that surpluses would continue. When yields declined, even modestly, the pressure immediately transferred to trade. Less grain in Egypt meant less grain available for export. Less grain on the Levantine coast meant higher prices in ports, with no agricultural hinterland of their own. The charts that modern economists construct from archaeological data are stark. Contraction, reduction, narrowing margins. Scarcity spreads through networks. In the cities, the effects were not invisible. They were felt in households, in markets, in the streets outside the palace gates. Archaeological layers at multiple Bronze Age sites show evidence of reduced consumption, narrower ceramic assemblages, fewer imported luxury goods. The visible abundance that had characterized the height of the Bronze Age began to contract. Internal cracks appear. The same empires absorbing agricultural stress were also maintaining military frontiers of enormous scale. The Hittites were managing pressure from the north and west simultaneously. Egypt was policing the Levantine coast and monitoring Nubia. Mycenaean palace states were competing among themselves for regional dominance. Bronze Age warfare was not cheap. Armies required equipment. Equipment required bronze. Bronze required tin and copper. Tin and copper required stable trade routes. Military expenditure was simultaneously the product of the trade system, and one of its heaviest consumers. Armies cost bronze. In the forges attached to palace complexes, smiths worked through the night to produce the weapons that the military machine demanded. Sword blades, arrowheads, spear tips, shield fittings. Every piece required a precise alloy. Too little tin and the blade was too soft. Too much and it became brittle. The formula was known. The knowledge was accumulated over generations, but the formula only worked if the tin arrived. What if tin stops? The sea had always been the nervous system of the Bronze Age world. Merchant vessels crossed the Eastern Mediterranean in seasonal cycles, moving grain, copper, tin, oil, wine, textiles, and luxury goods between ports that had grown wealthy precisely because of their position on those routes. Ugarit, Byblos, Cyprus, the Nile Delta, the Aegean Islands, the Anatolian coast. For centuries, those sea lanes had been functional. Dangerous. Piracy existed, storms existed, but functional. The volume of trade was enough to absorb the losses. The sea becomes hostile. Then the disruption accelerated. Egyptian inscriptions and Hittite administrative records both document a phenomenon their authors struggled to understand. Groups of maritime raiders moving along the coasts, attacking settlements, disrupting shipping, overwhelming local defenses. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. Exactly who they were, where they came from, what drove them, remains one of the most debated questions in Bronze Age scholarship. What is not debated is the effect. Ports lost protection. Ships stopped arriving. Merchants stopped sailing. Ports lose protection. When trade volume collapses in an interconnected system, the damage does not stay at the margins. It moves inward. Cities that had been built around the movement of goods suddenly had no goods to move. Administrative systems calibrated to manage abundance found themselves managing scarcity, and then in some cases managing nothing at all. The archaeological record at Bronze Age trading ports shows sudden transitions. Destruction layers, burned storage facilities, abandoned merchant quarters. Cities feel it immediately. In the markets that had once been loud, with the movement of grain and oil and metal, there was silence. Stalls that had received Cypriot copper, Egyptian linen, Mycenaean pottery stood empty. The rhythms of commerce that had organized urban life for generations broke down without warning. Silence spreads inland. The destruction was not contained to a single region. That is what makes the Bronze Age collapse. Distinct from ordinary political instability, it was systemic. Archaeological evidence of destruction and abandonment clusters in a narrow band of time, approximately 1200 to 1150 BCE, across a geographic spread that includes Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus simultaneously. Mycenae fell, Hattusa burned. Multiple Canaanite cities were destroyed and not rebuilt. Trade posts across the Aegean went dark. This is systemic. And then there is Ugarit. Ugarit was one of the great commercial cities of the late Bronze Age. Positioned on the Syrian coast, it was a hub through which traders from Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia all passed. Its archives have yielded some of the most significant documents in Bronze Age scholarship. Among those documents are the last letters ever sent from the city. A letter from the king of Alashia, probably Cyprus, warned Ugarit that ships had been spotted offshore. The enemy, he wrote, was coming by sea. Another letter, from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, explained that the city's armies were already deployed elsewhere. There were no forces to spare. A third letter, addressed to officials in Cilicia, begged for reinforcements. The situation was critical. The city could not hold. No reinforcements came. The fires that destroyed Ugarit baked its clay tablets hard, preserving them for 3,000 years. The city itself was never rebuilt. No one answered. In the decades that followed, the diplomatic networks that had held the Bronze Age world together dissolved. The correspondence between great kings, the careful formal exchanges of the Amarna period, the treaties negotiated with such precision, stopped, not because the language changed, because the institutions that had generated it no longer existed. Hittite records simply end. The palace at Mycenae stops producing tablets. The administrative centers that had tracked every shipment and every tax go silent. Communication lines severed. Isolation begins. Population movements intensified. Across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, as the palace economies collapsed, refugees moved along the Levantine coast. Migrants pressed into Egypt. Communities relocated away from the exposed coastal zones that had once been the arteries of commerce and became, in the period of collapse, corridors of danger. These movements fed further instability. New populations arrived in territories already under pressure. Existing social structures could not absorb the disruption. Migration reshapes borders. The palace economy itself was, in hindsight, architecturally fragile, in ways its administrators could not have recognized. Bronze Age states had concentrated economic activity in palatial redistribution centers. The palace received raw materials, the palace processed them. The palace distributed finished goods and rations. The palace was the economic architecture. There was no meaningful parallel structure, no alternative network, no distributed buffer against systemic failure. When the palace failed, everything it had organized failed with it. No decentralization buffer. In the great halls of Mycenae, of Hattusa, of Ugarit, where kings had received tribute, negotiated alliances, and administered the complex machinery of Bronze Age governance, the silence was absolute. The throne rooms stood empty. The administrative staff had dispersed. The symbols of royal authority were burned, looted, or simply abandoned. Power evaporates. One of the most striking markers of Bronze Age collapse is something that rarely receives adequate attention: the disappearance of writing. Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean administrators to track their palace economies, vanished completely with the collapse of the palaces it served. It would not be replaced in Greece for several centuries. Elsewhere across the affected regions, administrative literacy contracted sharply. The elaborate record-keeping systems that had characterized the height of Bronze Age civilization fell silent, not because people forgot how to write, but because the institutions that needed writing no longer functioned. Knowledge narrows. A broken clay tablet from a destroyed archive tells its own story. The records that survive do so only by accident, preserved in the destruction that was intended to erase everything. What was lost was not just words. It was institutional memory, the accumulated economic knowledge of centuries, the frameworks for coordinating large-scale production and exchange. Gone. A dark century begins. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the population maps shifted. The great urban centers of the Bronze Age shrank dramatically or disappeared entirely. Hattusa was not rebuilt. Mycenae never recovered its palatial scale. Multiple Canaanite cities were abandoned for generations. The world did not end, but it contracted. It became smaller, quieter, less densely organized. The networks that had required thousands of miles of continuous operation, copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, grain from Egypt, could not function in the absence of the institutional infrastructure that had sustained them. Smaller worlds emerge, but in the contracting world, adaptation was already beginning. Iron had existed before the collapse, it was known, but it had been treated as a secondary material, used for ornamental purposes, occasionally for small tools, never at scale. In the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, that changed. Iron production spread. Smiths learned to work it with charcoal, in ways that produced usable, durable metal. The critical difference between iron and bronze was structural. Bronze required two ingredients, copper and tin, from geographically separated sources, connected by long-distance trade. Iron ore was nearly everywhere. Its production could be local, less dependent on rare tin, less vulnerable to supply chain disruption, less tied to the palace redistribution economy that had collapsed. Iron was not merely a new material. It was a different economic logic, a technological pivot. The political geography that emerged from the collapse was different in character from what had preceded it. The giant palace states of the Bronze Age gave way to smaller, more locally anchored polities. Phoenician city-states on the Levantine coast, the early Greek polis, the kingdoms of the early Iron Age Near East. These were not reconstructions of what had been lost. They were structurally different, less centralized, less dependent on single palatial nodes, less exposed to the kind of systemic cascade that had destroyed the Bronze Age world, less interconnected, more durable. What the Bronze Age collapse ultimately produced was not simply destruction. It produced transformation. The first global economy, built on copper and tin, on grain and luxury goods, on palace bureaucracies and royal correspondence, was gone. It would not return in the same form. But from its ruins, a different model emerged, more distributed, more redundant. Built on a material, iron, that could be produced without a global supply chain. The collapse was not the end of complexity. It was the end of one kind of complexity and the beginning of another. Collapse birthed a different economic model. Empires rarely collapse from a single blow. They collapse when the systems that sustain them stop working, when the assumptions embedded in their architecture prove false under pressure. The Bronze Age did not end with a decisive battle. It ended when the web of connections that made it possible became too fragile to hold against accumulated strain. The copper stopped arriving. The tin stopped moving. The grain fell short. The ship stopped sailing. The letters went unanswered. And a civilization that had taken centuries to build fell silent in a generation. Every connected system carries that risk. The Bronze Age simply showed it first.